Hey guys, hope you're doing well and staying safe and cozy and getting lots of relaxation time and TV time. Today we're going to talk about Langston Hughes. So, Langston Hughes, I think, is a poet that's a little bit more accessible than somebody like a Wallace Stevens or even some of the poems that we read by William Carlos Williams. I think there's maybe a little bit more of a straightforward nature to his work that makes it more maybe more interesting or easier to read. So it also is makes for really good conversations. So I'm sad that we can't have that conversation. Um, so my plan today is not to really give you much. I'm not going to really talk about biographical information or kind of major themes of Hughes's work. I think I want you to think back to Tuesday and think back to the major concerns of the Harlem Renaissance. Those are Hughes's major concerns. So Hughes is actually one of the poets who both becomes really popular during the Harlem Renaissance. He's one of the main figures of this time, of this movement, but then outlasts. So becomes a kind of major poet, whereas most figures of the Harlem Renaissance, unfortunately, did not continue working in the literary world or continue a literary career. So that's one interesting thing about him. But like I said, these kind of issues of the Harlem Renaissance, so both trying to recognize the the oppression and the difficulty of African American life in the 20th century is one of his major concerns, but also finding the beauty and the pride in the Black community, in Black culture. And he's really concerned with kind of moving, as we saw in um, The Negro Artist and The Racial Mountain, in really using the popular culture and specifically Black popular culture as subject, as inspiration, as kind of place to find language and to find energy for these poems. So, what I'm going to do is actually just kind of introduce or talk about some major ideas for each specific poem. So I hope this will help give you some entry points or some frameworks for understanding these poems. It also connects, what I'm going to talk about connects to the response posts. So keep that in mind as we're going through here. Okay? So let's talk about this first poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I think I'll have to fact check this, but I think this is his first published poem. I have a video I'm going to play in just a couple minutes, but he actually wrote this when he was like 17. So when I think about that, I get depressed because I'm older than 17 and haven't written and probably will never write a poem as good as this. But I think this is a really kind of striking, stunning poem. What I have here is the poem in its original publication. So we see kind of how it was printed. We see what it looked like on the page. Let me say this: Hughes is a modernist, right? So he's connected to the Harlem Renaissance. So those concerns I think were primary, but he was also concerned with these other issues that modernist poets were concerned with, things like kind of the visual display of the poem on the page is interesting to him. These kind of innovations in language, in form, and in subject. Hughes is doing that just like William Carlos Williams, just like Wallace Stevens. So this was published in a magazine before it was published in a book. Okay, I think we probably all noticed one kind of interesting part of this printing here. And that is, if you haven't, this symbol, it's kind of strange to see, right? That it's printed alongside this poem, right? Well, this poem was originally published in 1921. So that's before this symbol was associated with the Nazis, right? So it's interesting to think. Partly why I wanted to show you this is just to kind of get us to think a little bit, and this would have been a conversation if we were in class, but get us to think about how kind of symbols take on new meanings in different contexts. When we see this now, it's like it's a strange thing to see, but when they used it here, of course, there was no association with Hitler or the Nazis. I think it's maybe trying to connect because there is this the idea of the Euphrates, Congo. It's maybe feels ancient in a way, and so that's maybe why the publisher, the printer, the editor of this magazine chose to include this graphic. But it's just interesting to think about. So here we see the original publication. Um, I like to see poems in their original context and think about what they looked like. Okay, so now we have this video. This is Langston Hughes reading this poem, and he also provides a little context for it, and kind of, so I think it's helpful. I'm gonna play it here. If you can't hear it that well, pause this video, go to YouTube, and just look up the title of the poem. You'll find this. This is it's a pretty famous reading, so I think you'll find it.
This is The Negro Speaks of Rivers, one of my earliest poems, written in 1920, just after I came out of high school. The way this poem came to be written was that I was going to Mexico to visit my father, who lived in Mexico City, and on the train going across the Mississippi River, just outside St. Louis, I looked out the window and I saw this great muddy river flowing down toward the heart of the South, and I began to think about what this river meant to the Negro people, how, in a sense, our history was linked to this river, how in slavery time my grandmother told me that to be sold down the Mississippi was one of the worst things that could happen to a Negro slave. And then I remembered that I'd read about Abraham Lincoln going down the Mississippi as a young man, and he went on a raft to New Orleans, and he saw human beings bought and sold in the slave market there, and he was so horrified by this that he never forgot it. And many years later, of course, we know that it was Lincoln who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And so, as the train went on into the gathering dusk, because it had been about sunset when we crossed the river, I took my father's letter out of my pocket and began to write down on the back of his letter this poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers.
Okay, so there's the poem. So Hughes himself provides some context for this poem, what he was thinking about, kind of what was on his mind, what was the impetus for writing this poem. So it's interesting to think about this image of the river, him seeing the Mississippi, and that was kind of the inciting incident to create this poem. And of course, the image of the river repeats throughout this poem, and creates kind of interesting consonants between different times and different places. So a couple of things. The other thing I was thinking as I was listening to it, I didn't have planned to say this, but the connection between rivers and rivers flowing, and then how he talks about blood and blood flowing, and the kind of rivers and the blood and how that connects. I think there's a lot there you can think about, and I'll talk about a couple of things that connect to this idea of blood or blood connection, but rivers flowing, blood flowing, especially if we think about in the context of slavery, what the Mississippi represented, as he described in the video, in terms of this place of kind of oppression, of violence towards black individuals, and maybe blood flowing into the Mississippi River. That's something that just kind of popped into my mind. Okay, so I'll kind of go with what I already decided to talk about. Sorry about that. Sorry for that aside. So this poem, a couple of entry points here, a couple of things to think about. The idea of the relationship between the particular and the general. So this is in group number one's response, guiding questions, or response, kind of response group. The idea that the poem is called "The Negro Speaks of Rivers." So the word "the" is really important. Why not "a"? Right? Why not a general or random person? There's a kind of feeling that this speaker is representative, is a figurehead of some kind, right? It is the person who is speaking. And I think that there's a sense that there's something happening between this individual speaker, but who the speaker is representing, or who the speaker is speaking for, right? So it feels like a representative speaker. It also feels, and I think this is clear, it feels like a person of color. The speaker is a person of color, right? We know that from the title. Okay, so I want us to think a little bit about this I here. One of Hughes's main influences is Whitman. So we'll talk a little bit more about that with I too, but how is the I functioning here? Who is this I? That's a main question of this poem, right? So who is this I? The other kind of main entry point here is thinking about the relationship of the past and present. So I'm going to talk about grammar here for a second, so bear with me. So this I've known, the repetition of this tense, which I've broken up from a contraction here to I have known. Well, this is the perfect present tense. So think about what sense this tense brings. To think about I have known, that means that you have known it in the past and you also know it now. So that tense evokes a sense of past and present. There is a kind of relationship created in the grammar, in the syntax, in the verb tense here, right? So there's a relationship between past and present created in the verb tense. I think you can see this throughout the poetry that we read for today, but he's very interested in Black identity in the US. But specifically in this poem, I think he's really concerned with the idea of Black identity in the US and connection to African heritage. So group number two, you're thinking about these places that he invokes in the poem. Euphrates, the Congo, the Nile. So these rivers, what is he doing with these rivers? What is he saying about Blackness and what it means to be an African American? Okay, so that's very just a few things. I think we could talk about this poem for 45 minutes, right? It's really deceptively simple. There's a lot here. I think we could talk about what does it mean to know, to say I've known. We could talk about this image of the muddy bosom of the river and why it becomes this kind of feminized image. So there's a lot here. Hopefully these give some entry points. I'm looking forward to your responses. Okay, so let's talk about I too. I'm not going to say a lot about this poem. I think it's a little bit more straightforward. But I do have the beginning of Song of Myself here to help us remember Walt Whitman, and then to help us think about how is Hughes connecting and invoking this poem, and how is he revising that? What is he doing that's taking this idea of the song of myself, how is he taking that and kind of re-singing this song, thinking about who got left out in that original vision of the American life, American identity. So remember the beginning of Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. So let's think about the beginning of I too. I too sing America, right? So invoking Whitman directly to say Song of Myself, and this idea that I too, so the two here is really important, right? I also sing America. I'm also a part of it. So what is he saying there? Who is he trying to include in this vision? Who does he feel like got left out in Whitman's vision? I think too, think about the repetition here and then the slight variation of the first line and the last line. I too sing America. I too am America. There's something significant there to say I'm singing this, but also I am this. What does it mean to be something versus to celebrate or to sing? Okay, the other thing I want to talk about, and this is what I'm asking group number 3 to think about, is the controlling metaphor of the poem. So, what I mean by controlling metaphor is a metaphor that kind of dominates or extends throughout the piece, throughout the literary work. Um, so, what is this metaphor? Well, I would call it a metaphor of America as family. So, seeing America as family, and specifically the black community as what he labels the darker brother. So we're in the kind of we're in a house, right? There's a family here, and the darker brother, the black community, is pushed to the kitchen to eat. So there's a lot of resonances there. I think there's even thinking about like African American domestic workers. There's something at play there. So I want you to think about this as a controlling metaphor. How is this functioning? What is the significance of the metaphor as America as family? Right? I think he's a person who's really concerned with the black experience or the African American experience, but also wants to connect to others. Right? He's not just concerned with that experience. He wants to see what kind of connections are happening. So I'm interested to see what you think about how this is moving and how this is shaping the meaning of the poem, this controlling metaphor. Okay, so that's I too. Okay, so Weary Blues, which is, our probably maybe most complex poem of today or of this class period. But to give you some entry points, I brought in the cover of The Weary Blues, which is the title of Hughes's first collection of poetry, and this is the original. This is the original cover for that. There's something really interesting here. There's brightness here. There's kind of a light, and I wouldn't say joy, but an energy in the color, in the design. But there's also a kind of melancholy feeling if you look at the face of the man, and the idea that it's silhouette. It feels like this combination of kind of energy, a bright color, with kind of melancholy or darkness. And so I think that's significant when we think about the blues as this tradition that's shaping the meaning of the poem, the weary blues. So even if we think about this term weary, why weary? What's going on there? So a little bit about the blues. It's a folk tradition that combines the comic and the tragic. So one way of thinking about blues is laughing to keep from crying. Okay, so this idea that there's this maybe silliness, a sense of comedy, or a sense of forced joy almost in the midst of difficult circumstances. So there's a recognition of kind of weariness, of sadness, of melancholy, but it's wrapped into a kind of music that feels energized or has a lot of, how would I say it, veiled or like a kind of false joy or even false sense of joy. So there's this kind of energy, there's this excitement, there's this vitality to the music. You can hear it in like the piano and the voices and the kind of in the speed of the songs, but it's also but that's kind of covering over this crying, right? That's the laughing when underneath it there's this weariness, there's this sadness. So the blues shapes this poem in theme, in form, in tone, in style. So what do I mean by that? Theme. So it's looking at this kind of double experience that the blues embodies. Form. So it's like using a blues song, a blues like there's a lot of repetition. It's telling a kind of story that is all taken from the blues. Tone, having that kind of feeling of underlying melancholy with a recognition of or a display of kind of energy and joy. We can feel that tone, right? It has that feeling. And style. What I mean by this is like language in terms of the repetition, the so form is like kind of how it's all constructed. Style are those small choices that give this feeling or give a certain feeling. Okay. So this is also an interesting poem because it's a narrative. So there's a kind of story here. So this is a narrative poem, and I think it's really interesting because it's an observer watching the blues man. So what I think it's worth thinking about what so what meaning does that create, or what effect does the idea that we're observing an observer who watches this blues man. There's a kind of double narrative perspective here, or a double distancing happening. I think that's a really interesting choice, and this isn't part of the response or anything, but I think it's something to think about. What effect does that give you? I also want you to think of the musical quality of the poem. We talked about how the blues shapes the form, thinking of the language, the rhythm, the repetition. So even these first lines, droning a drowsy, syncopated tune, rocking back and forth to a mellow croon. So there's rhyme here, right? It feels kind of subtle, but there's rhyme, so that's giving it a musical quality. Think about the rhythm, droning, and how the words can create a sense of rhythm. So droning with that long O and drowsy, those words, it makes you kind of say them or spend more time on them. Droning, drowsy, then think about syncopated. Syncopated tune, rocking back and forth to a mellow croon, right? So think about how the word choice is creating the sense of rhythm, right? This is very modernist, right? How a poet uses language to create a sense of rhythm, not fitting language into a predetermined form or rhythm. I think repetition too. He did a lazy sway. He did a lazy sway. Right. That's trying to create a kind of sense of musicality to the poem. The other thing I want to think about is Hughes was really interested in bringing in the Black vernacular. So the way people, the Black community, actually spoke on a day-to-day level. So think about the way he represents the language or the singing of the blues man. Ain't got nobody in all this world, ain't got nobody but myself, right? So the MA is trying to suggest a certain kind of sound. So he's trying to tap into the Black way of speaking and trying to imbue that into a poem. Okay, so there's lots to think about there. Um, I think for the response group, you're thinking about this blue, so this kind of double experience, this laughing and crying, this sadness and happiness. How do those sit side by side? What choices or things are in the poem that make you feel that? Okay. Lastly, our last poem, theme for English B. I think this is a pretty popular poem, and I think it's pretty easy to read. I want us to think about a couple of things. Putting this into a context of education is really interesting. So, thinking about what does it mean to be a Black person who exists in a context of white education. Um, so it's a Black student in a white environment, and the kind of cognitive dissonance that that creates in terms of where you go after you're done with class, and then who are the people around you. So this makes me think of when Hurston talks about going to Barnard and how she feels most colored when she's in a white environment, right? This is what this poem is exploring. So I think this poem is very much about what it means to be Black. So it's about Black identity. So it's exploration of what it means to be Black in the US, but also to be American. So he sees that these things are connected, and he's looking for connection. So where do you see this kind of idea or this search for connection? A theme is just like a personal essay, so it's another way to call it a personal essay. I think there's a kind of like journal-like form to the poem here. Um, so when we read this poem, think about Black identity and also the context of a kind of white education within a predominantly white United States, and what is the experience of being an educated Black person? What are those dissonances that you feel, but what are those connections you feel as well? Okay, Langston Hughes. Hope you enjoy these poems. I think there's a lot to think about, and but they're accessible in a way.